I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it.
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The president, as you may have heard, fired back at the media today in New York after delivering a short speech on his proposal for a national infrastructure project. President Trump held a heated news conference where he defended his reaction to the street fighting and the car attack in Charlottesville, Virginia over the weekend. We'll get to what the president's remarks meant in just a minute, but first an update on them with Fox chief national correspondent Ed Henry.
Tucker, great to see you. President Trump being battered tonight by critics. CNN charging he went, quote, off the rails. And to be sure, suggesting there were fine people on both sides on Saturday when there were neo-Nazis and white supremacists there is going to be a problem for this president. But lost in the hysteria is that he did again very clearly denounce neo-Nazis. And he pointed out something liberals do not want to admit, that there was violence among some of the counter-protesters like Antifa. Watch.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
Let
me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. So, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day.
Then the media pushed the president again. Why didn't you initially call it terror on Saturday? The president could not have been clearer about how he felt about the person among those neo-Nazis who killed a woman with his car. Here's what he said.
I think the driver of the car is a disgrace to himself, his family, and this country. And that is, you can call it terrorism, you can call it murder, you can call it whatever you want.
Then, as it was pressed on whether he was putting radicals of the alt-left on the same moral plane as white supremacists, and while the president did, he was pressed about that, he made fair points about the danger of knocking down statues, erasing our history. He seemed to undo the positive nature of his statement yesterday at the White House when he clearly denounced neo-Nazis. He went back to what he was saying Saturday, that there was blame on both sides, and somehow added there were fine people on both sides, as he was asked about whether statues of Thomas Jefferson should come down next because he was a slave owner. Watch.
You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Treated unfairly, sir. I'm sorry, I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day it looked like they had some rough, bad people, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this. There are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country.
Now, to take a step back, yesterday was going to be all about cracking down on China for unfair trade. Today was going to be all about infrastructure, the plan that the president thinks can create a lot of jobs. Very little of that message on either one of those big campaign promises is going to break through now. Tucker?
Thanks, Ed. One thing the president said today deserves more attention than it will likely get. Yesterday, a mob tore down a Civil War soldiers' memorial in Durham, North Carolina. Police stood idly by, and liberals across the country applauded it. Which statues are next, the president asked today? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson? It's not a joke. Suddenly, it's a serious question. Thomas Jefferson indisputably was a great man. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and maybe most importantly, the greatest thinker in American political history. All of us live in his shadow. Unfortunately, however, Jefferson was also a slaveholder. That's real. It's a moral taint. We ought to remember it. But to the fanatics on the left, it means that Jefferson must be purged from public memory forever. The demands are already coming that we do that. In 2015, students at the University of Missouri demanded the removal of a Jefferson statue. 2 years ago on CNN, anchor Ashley Banfield suggested the Jefferson Memorial in Washington might have to go. Needless to say, there is literally no limit when you start thinking like this. Last year, hundreds of activists in New York demanded the statue of Theodore Roosevelt at the American Natural History Museum be dismantled. They argued that Roosevelt was a racist. If that's the standard, nobody is safe. Watch out, Abraham Lincoln, you're next. Now, to be clear, as if it's necessary, slavery is evil. If you believe in the rights of the individual, it's actually hard to think of anything worse than slavery. But let's be honest, up until 150 years ago, when a group of brave Americans fought and died to finally put an end to it, slavery was the rule rather than the exception around the world, and had been for thousands of years, sadly. Plato owned slaves. So did Muhammad, peace be upon him. Many African tribes held slaves and sold them. The Aztecs did too. Before he liberated Latin America, Simon Bolivar owned slaves. Slaveholding was so common among the North American Indians that the Cherokee brought their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. And it wasn't something they learned from the European settlers. Indians were holding and trading slaves when Christopher Columbus arrived. And by the way, he owned slaves too. Now, none of this is a defense of the atrocity of human bondage. It is an atrocity. The point, however, is that if we're going to judge the past by the standards of the present, if we're going to reduce a person's life to the single worst thing he ever participated in, we had better be prepared for the consequences of that. And here's why. 41 of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence held slaves. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, had a plantation full of slaves. George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, also owned slaves, unfortunately. But does that make what they wrote illegitimate? If these men were simply racist villains, and that's all they were, then the society they created is as evil as they were. There's no reason to respect its traditions or uphold its laws. The First Amendment, for example, the right to speak freely. For hundreds of years, Americans have revered it. Now the left dismisses it as the work of white supremacist slaveholders. It is worthless, they tell us. It must go. It is now routine to hear liberals claim that hate speech, whatever that is, isn't protected by the First Amendment, though, of course, the whole point of the First Amendment is to protect speech that offends people. It's a statement of shocking ignorance, and yet it is now common. CNN's Chris Cuomo said it. He's supposedly a lawyer. At Pomona College in California, students there are claiming that free speech is, quote, a tool appropriated by hegemonic institutions, whatever that means. They say the right of free expression should only apply to certain racial groups. But that's not racist because, as you know, there's no racism on the left. They're just sincere people concerned about hate. There's actually a vitally important debate going on in the country right now, and it's not about statues or even the alt-right and Antifa. It's about America's institutions and whether they are worth preserving. Radicals on the left want to tear it all down, as they did the statue in Durham yesterday. Equality under the law, protections for the individual against the mob, the absolute right to say and believe anything you choose. Those will be gone, replaced by something darker and more rigidly conformist. Is that a country you want to live in? If it's not, now's the time to speak up. Our elites are refusing to. They're too afraid. John Daniel Davidson is a senior correspondent at The Federalist, and he joins us tonight. John, this does seem like a turning point somehow, not just on the right but also on the left, these events of the last 2 days, and there seems to be a new intensity on the left. Am I imagining that?
No, you're not. And we do seem like we're at a turning point, but this has been coming down the pike for a number of years. I remember 2 years ago, we had the 150th anniversary of the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, and you had people in the mainstream media at that time calling for the desecration of Confederate graves, not just tearing down statues, but digging up remains, removing them, bulldozing over cemeteries. And this iconoclastic impulse is native to the left. This is what China's Cultural Revolution was all about. If you want to see where tearing down statues by mobs will get you, look at pictures of China's Cultural Revolution where they tore down statues, exactly right. Temples, the whole thing, even stomping on them.
But Mao did that, and the Khmer Rouge did that, And the Taliban did that in Afghanistan for political reasons. I mean, look, I'm not, naturally, for whatever it's worth, not very sympathetic to the Confederacy. I'm an American, and I'm against insurrections, period. So, but it's not about that. The people who are attacking these statues know nothing about history. They don't know who Robert E. Lee was. They don't know who Stonewall Jackson was. They're trying to delegitimize the U.S. government and the traditions of American society because they don't believe in them. I mean, this is transactional. They're doing this to achieve a goal that has nothing to do with the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of people on the right, conservatives on the right who are saying, yes, maybe we should move these statues to a museum, miss the point. This is not about the Confederacy. Exactly. This is not about the Civil War. This is about political power, and it's about a small group of people on the left trying to exert outsized influence on American politics by following in the footsteps of Mao, of the armed thugs in the Weimar Republic, of the Taliban. This is these are tactics that are well known. You start by tearing down statues and burning books, and eventually you go after people.
One of the ironies of all of this, and it's been interesting to watch on a split screen, left and right fighting each other, horrifying, but also instructive. One of the things I don't like about some of these white supremacist groups is that race is at the center of their worldview. And I don't want to live in a world where race is at the center of the worldview. But I see the same on the left. I see people with signs attacking white supremacy, or it's always about race for them as well. They seem every bit as race-obsessed and angry as the people they're fighting. But don't acknowledge that for some reason.
This is what happens with with identity politics. If you push identity politics, eventually you get around to identity politics for white people, which is a dangerous thing in a country that has a huge white majority. And this is why the left has been sowing these seeds of what's happening now for a long time. Are they surprised that eventually some white people are going to say, yeah, let's do identity politics, and we're going to have white identity politics? It's all poisonous garbage.
No, but this is the terminus. This is the end. What do you think happens when you force people to line up by their immutable characteristics, by race? You think you're not going to wind up with every group doing that? Of course you are. This is what identity politics looks like on left and right. Why does nobody make that point?
And it's totally un-American, too. America is not about ethnicity. It's not about national origin. It's about creed. And there's no place in the American constitutional system for identity politics, left or right. Plain and simple.
Thank you for saying that. You'll probably be attacked as something for doing so, but I'm glad you did. John, thank you.
Thanks.
Rioters in Durham, North Carolina destroyed a war memorial yesterday, and police simply stood by and watched it happen. Local governments are not keeping order in the streets for some reason. The chattering classes don't care. They're more concerned with rolling back free speech rights for the population than in protecting us from disorder. Why is that the case? We'll try to get to the bottom of it. Also, President Obama's biggest program for illegal immigrants turns 5 years old today. We've got a cake. We'll talk to a supporter of that program up ahead. Rioters in the city of Durham, North Carolina destroyed a statue honoring Confederate war dead. They pulled it down yesterday while cops stood by and did nothing. Well, you'd think the government allowing policy decisions to be made by mob violence would be a big concern among liberals. It's not a good precedent to set, but they don't seem bothered at all. Instead, a top priority on the left right now is securing a rollback of free speech rights for you and me. Yesterday on MSNBC, Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors said the First Amendment's protections don't apply to whatever is deemed to be hate speech.
We're seeing a movement of white nationalists rising up because they've been emboldened by Trump and his government. Hate speech, which is what we're seeing coming out of white nationalist groups, is not protected under the First Amendment rights.
Jasmine Canik is a political commentator, and she joins us tonight. Jasmine, thanks for coming on. So,
thanks for having me.
Hate speech hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. You hear this a lot. Of course, hate speech is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights. There are a bunch of Supreme Court decisions, Brandenburg versus Ohio being, I think, the most important, that explain it very explicitly, yes, language you disagree with is covered by the First Amendment. But tell me where this idea comes from, because everybody seems to be repeating it.
Well, first of all, Patrisse Cullors is a good friend of mine, and I definitely understand what she's saying. Legally, is hate speech protected? Absolutely. Should it be? That depends on where you fall on the issue. When you're talking about white nationalism and white supremacists, yes, there is a lot of hate speech from that side. And she's absolutely right. When we talk about issues around Black lives and issues around equality, there isn't the hate that is coming from the other side. Let me put it to you that way.
Well, I guess that all kind of depends on what you think is hateful. I mean, look, let me just say really clearly, I'm against people hurting each other's feelings. I'm for politeness.
No, when you have the KKK and white folks talking about death to black people, death to African Americans, calling people the N-word.
I agree completely.
That's hateful. No, it's not awful. That's hateful. That's a perfect example of hate speech.
It's absolutely hateful.
And you want to talk about
hold on, wait. So may I ask you a question? I mean, this is a pointless. This is actually kind of the point I was making. And I agree with everything you said. That is hateful and it's awful. I'm offended by it.
It is.
But really, what you're saying is you're offended. And that's the problem with hate speech, this fake category that we've made up all of a sudden, because it's entirely subjective. What's offensive to you or hateful to you may not be as offensive to me. We're both American citizens. We both live under the same Bill of Rights.
I agree.
You see the problem. So attempts by the left to ban speech are as bad as attempts by the right to ban speech. So why don't we just call a truce and stop trying to prevent people we disagree with from speaking?
No, I definitely agree with you on that point. It is a slippery slope when you start to try to define what is hateful and what is not. But it is really clear, especially given the images and the video that we saw coming out of Charlottesville, there was a lot of hate speech. There was a lot of hatefulness. And I think that a lot of Americans are really tired of it. I don't think it's just liberal Democrats. I think Americans, period, are very tired of the rhetoric on both sides. And when you talk about Charlottesville, for example, what I thought was really interesting was you had a lot of politicians coming out condemning it and calling for unity. And I remember saying to myself, you need to lead by example. There's a lot of hateful rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. that Americans are watching every single day. And then you have instances like Charlottesville and what's going on around the country. People are angry. People are upset.
I agree. But hold on. We can't have that conversation or any conversation until we both agree that we have the right to say what we believe and that we're not going to be punished for doing that. And I see a lot of attempts on the left to shut down the conversation because they don't like what the other side is saying. And that is not the road to reconciliation or harmony. That's the road to division and war. Look, I don't think there are attempts by the right to shut
to
shut down people's speech. Name one.
Even on this very network. Come on now.
Name one. I can't. Are you kidding? Everyone with any point of view is allowed on my show. In fact, welcomed on my show. Let me ask you a question, since we're talking about the events the last couple of days. So, left-wing protesters are upset by the existence of Civil War memorials, Robert E. Lee statues, because they're symbols of racial discrimination and hate. If you knew that there were 50 public buildings paid for by taxpayers, maintained by taxpayers in this country, named after a Ku Klux Klan recruiter, would that bother you?
Look, there are buildings in Los Angeles. There was a building in Los Angeles named after one of the most racist police chiefs of the Los Angeles Police Department.
No, there's no comparison. Hold on. This is not a racist police chief. This is the exalted cyclops of the KKK, Robert Byrd, the longest-serving U.S. senator who just died several years ago. Why is there no effort to take his name off these buildings? As a former Klan recruiter, you'd think people would be offended by his name.
I think you need to give it time. But I think one of the issues is that you can take down all of the monuments. You can change the names of a lot of buildings, but you can't change American history. And I think that's part of what's missing from this conversation. Do I want to see monuments and statues of people who are racist or supported slavery? Not really, but at the same time, I don't completely want to erase American history either, because I want to make sure future generations know what happened. And I think we're in this cycle right now. We're in such a rush to get rid of things that remind us of bad times in our history, and it's like, yeah, it was bad, but you know what, we also have to remember what happened and pass that down in hopes of not repeating it as well.
Well, I think that's right, and also the United States ended slavery around the world, and maybe we should get some credit for that too, don't you think? Okay, we're out of time. Yeah. Think about that, Jasmine. Thanks for coming on tonight. We can't even get America to talk about reparations, so no, thank you. Yeah, I think we deserve some credit. Well, the War Memorial in Durham was destroyed. Police did nothing to stop protesters or the people who pulled it off the pedestal. Didn't even bother to arrest the head vandals. Up next, we'll talk to 2 law enforcement veterans about why police are tolerating destruction in the public square. Stay tuned. The destruction of a war memorial in Durham, North Carolina yesterday was the latest example of police inaction in the face of a rioting mob. Law enforcement simply looked on as the statue was pulled down and made no arrests in the immediate aftermath. Only today, someone was finally arrested. After yesterday's incident, Durham County Sheriff Mike Andrews urged people to stop complaining.
Some might say my deputy stood by and did nothing, or don't mistake restraint for inaction. Had I ordered my deputies to engage a hostile crowd, there would have been serious injuries. Statues can be replaced, lives cannot. It's time for some ground rules. We must make clear what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior. No one is getting away with this.
In other words, don't worry that the police let anarchy reign, because they're watching videos of what happened and they're going to try to identify and arrest the people responsible at some point. We hope you're assured. Imagine the fire department making the same case. They're going to let your house burn down, then they're going to sift through the ashes to try to find the arsonist afterwards, and by the way, don't complain. Well, the message of all this is clear, of course. The left has free rein to destroy what they don't like, and police will do nothing about it. We've seen that a lot. What will they feel empowered to destroy next? Well, Stacey Abrams, a Democrat running for governor of Georgia, has already demanded the destruction of Stone Mountain. That's the world's largest bas-relief sculpture. It's an artistic masterpiece, by the way, but it commemorates Confederate figures, so she wants it taken off the wall. That would put her in the same league as the Taliban, which you'll remember blew up immense ancient stone Buddhas because they offended the official ideology. If you've got views the left doesn't like, this should give you pause, especially now that we know the police won't intervene. What can't they do to you? That's a question that ought to be rattling around your head. Vincent Hill is a former Nashville police officer. Michael Baboni is a former Homeland Security advisor for New York State, and they join us now. Vincent Hill, to you first. Why is this different from the fire department saying, you know, we're not going to put your house out, it's on fire, but it would be pretty dangerous if we showed up on the scene, but we're going to figure out later what happened? How is this different from that?
Well, Tucker, thanks for having me. I think there's a huge difference. Of course, when there's a fire, there's an immediate, imminent threat of a loss of life, right? So what the police in Charlottesville were dealing with, and we've seen it from the left time and time again in these anti-Trump protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, where people, when police show up, they immediately escalate. They don't want to listen. They start to throw rocks, urine at police. So I think the police were right in watching, and a lot of people don't realize they were actually keeping the peace, because you can actually arrest someone at a later time if you have probable cause to do that. So I think if police would have shown up in riot gear, we would have had the left, again, once police had to use force because someone wanted to resist or use force against them, then we'd have the left saying, look at these white racist thug officers that are there beating on these people. So it would have fed into what the left wanted us to see. Well, there's no doubt. I mean, you're right. You're right. They absolutely would have said that. On the other hand, Michael, what's the point of having police if they don't stop violence while it's occurring? And by the way, people were hurt in Charlottesville, and the police didn't do anything about it. I mean, it was discouraging to watch that.
The purpose of a police officer is to protect life and property, preserve the peace. And I think we're kind of missing the point in terms of this whole event. Where were the police? Not when the moment of the violence occurred, where were they beforehand? Good policing involves intelligence. It involves people on the street knowing what's going to happen, anticipating the violence that could erupt, and putting resources to apply that. This is such an ironic situation in the sense that, yes, we could prevent something from happening by not getting engaged. But if you take that to the extreme, what would happen if you had an active shooter in a school and you had a police officer show up and said, I'm not going to go into the school, I'm going to wait for backup because it may be too dangerous, or maybe I could escalate the situation. That response has been rejected after Columbine. So there is a responsibility, but it begins way before the violence occurs.
Right. No, that sounds exactly right. Vincent, let me just say I'm deeply sympathetic to the police. I can't imagine what it must be like to wade into something like that and people throw rocks and urine at you. But I get the sense in watching these, not just in Charlottesville, but also in Baltimore and in Ferguson and Berkeley, that the police are being told by the political figures to whom they report, don't get involved. This is a political decision coming from on high. I wonder if you think that's what's going on.
Yeah, and that very well could be the case, Tucker. I mean, when you look at it from a number standpoint, and I always look at things factually, right? When you look at the size of these crowds, take Durham, for instance, you had a crowd of over 100 people. I'm sure you didn't have that many officers there on the scene, right? So let's say you had to call for backup. Let's say you had to call other officers in. Then you've taken those officers off the street to allow other crimes to happen. So, you know, when you're looking at things like that, it's a lot easier to say, yeah, I'm going to Monday morning quarterback this when you're not there and you're not having to make these decisions in real time.
Yeah.
Of course, well, of course it is. That's why we hire the police. That's why we give them money and guns, so they can make those hard decisions. No, I'm not being glib. I'm being sincere. That's why we respect the police, because it's a hard gig. So, Michael, what do you think was going through the minds of cops in Durham yesterday when this group of angry children pulled the statue down and they had to stand there? Like, do you think the average cop wanted to stand there?
I can't imagine that they did. One of the ironies, of course, is that the picture of the woman who's climbing up on that ladder, if she had fallen down, would she have been able to sue the municipality saying, wait a minute, how I got hurt by doing this? Why didn't you protect me? That's a part of the irony here. When you come in, you have to establish the rule of law. There is no protected speech that is violent. It just isn't. So what you do is you separate the folks. And, by the way, this didn't come out of the blue. You had Charlottesville beforehand. It's about a 360-degree awareness as to what's going on, not just in your community, but around. And so the folks in Durham didn't think this could possibly happen. Well, they need better intelligence from my perspective. And by the way, it is the job of folks in government to do the Monday morning quarterback, because we're going to be a part of the review panel and the review boards to say, were the actions of the police officers appropriate? It's our job.
Right. And this is going to happen again. Gentlemen, Michael, Vincent, thanks all for coming on. I appreciate it.
Tucker, always a pleasure.
Thanks.
Today is the 5th anniversary of President Obama's biggest program to assist illegal immigrants, DACA. Up next, we'll talk to someone who wants the Trump administration to preserve the program. She'll explain why. Stay tuned. Today is the 5th anniversary of DACA, President Obama's program deferring deportations for illegal immigrants who arrived in the United States underage. Despite promising to do so during the 2016 campaign, the current president has not yet ended the program. The administration says it's still under review. Demonstrations in support of DACA were held around the country today. Marielena Incapi is the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center. She wants DACA to remain in force, and she joins us tonight. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation.
You want it to remain in place. It's an executive order, not a law. Why not do it the American way, the Democratic way, and have the Congress pass it? Why aren't you lobbying members of Congress to embrace your view?
Yeah, so thanks again for the invitation, Tucker. The thing is, DACA is working. It's been in place for 5 years. It's been part of our economy. As of today, we have nearly 800,000 young immigrants who have come forward voluntarily, have trusted the federal government, passed a national security test, screening, and have paid a fee. And they've had this temporary protection from deportation. In keeping the program in place, President Trump has made a decision so far and has seen that it's actually actually working. And he himself, as he's learning about the program and learning about these so-called dreamers or young immigrants, has talked about the importance of finding a way to keep them here and doing something good for them.
Right. That would be, of course, a direct betrayal of his campaign promises made repeatedly during the 2016 campaign. But still, you're not answering my question, which is, in a democracy, why shouldn't the people get to weigh in on this? Why not have Congress make this law, and rather than this kind of jury-rigged system which we have now? And you know the answer, which is people don't support this. They don't want more illegal immigration into this country. So we're bypassing their will and just doing it through the White House, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Tucker. Absolutely. Look, the DACA program is only a temporary protection from deportation. And, you know, President Trump can continue the program in place and exercise the same presidential authority that previous administrations, like Republican administrations like Eisenhower, Reagan, Bush Sr., etc. But at the end of the day, I agree with you completely. We need congressional action. Dreamers should be put on a road to citizenship.
Yeah, but let's be real. Look, you do this for a living, so you know as well as I, better than I, the amount of lying around this issue. So Democrats are jumping up and down. It's, you're a racist, you hate children if you're not for DACA. But they're not leading the charge in the Congress to vote on this. Let's see the legislation that says, hey, if you make it over the border and you're under 18, you get amnesty. That's what DACA is. Why don't they just codify that in the U.S. code? Because they know voters don't want it. That's why. People don't want more illegal immigration. And so they won't try and pass it as a law.
Right. No, there are actually efforts right now, Tucker, right? So the DREAM Act was introduced recently by Senator Graham and Senator Durbin. There are about 7 other bills, both in the Senate and the House. The polls actually show that Americans do support Dreamers. And in fact, some of your own Fox News colleagues, right, like Charles Krapheimer, Rush Limbaugh, all talk about, even Rush Limbaugh says, right, this is logical to provide
I don't think that's how you pronounce his name,
for
but
Dreamers.
Still, but hold on. Look, the country is crowded in a lot of places. There were 320 million people here. If current immigration continues, we're going to get to 500 million by the end of the century. You know, that's a lot. That's an awful lot of people. And I think that if you were to say to the public really clearly, anytime someone comes into the country illegally under 18, they automatically become a U.S. citizen. I think you'd find support for that would be around, I don't know, maybe 10%. Like, nobody would be for that. Let's be honest.
Yeah, but Tucker, you know, you're a smart guy, and that's not what the DACA program does. The DACA program, or the DREAM Act, right, talks about a small category of people who came when they were children. I mean, look, they have grown up here. They've gone to school here. With DACA, many of them have bought cars, have bought houses, are paying for their college tuition. It is completely illogical. It makes no sense.
Well, getting it makes no sense to enforce your immigration law. This is insane. This is insane. You are saying that people who break the law ought to get a special pass because they have political clout. That is not the way it's supposed to work. If you think that anyone who comes here underage illegally should become a citizen, pass a law that says that. But this is basically the executive branch of government saying to the Congress, we don't care about your laws. And that's why it's being challenged, of course, in the courts, as you know.
No, listen, DACA has been challenged in the past and it's lost, right? Both the state of Mississippi, the ICE agents tried to challenge DACA. It actually has survived legal muster. On the other hand, though, one of the things is that in the both DACA or DREAM Act's context, we're talking about individuals who've been here for many, many years, who came when they were children, who have to pass certain criteria and would then be eligible. It's not an automatic, simply because you came unlawfully and you were under 18, you're eligible for that. And there's a reason that this program has survived for the last years and has been in place even in the first 8 months of this administration. It makes logical sense. It's good for our economy. It's good for America. And your viewers know that. And President Trump should exercise his presidential authority and should not allow himself to be bullied by people like Paxton in Texas.
Okay. Good for the economy. I wish we had more time and you could explain in some detail how it's good for the economy.
I know. Happy to come back and talk about that.
Good luck with that. Marlena, thank you for that. Good to see you.
Thank you, Tucker. Really appreciate it.
A gay rights group preparing to sue the Trump administration for keeping the transgendered troops out of the military. What is their argument exactly? Remember, that group will join us after the break. It's been 3 weeks since President Trump announced his plan to reinstate the ban on transgender soldiers serving the military, which had existed without issue until 2016. The policy's revival is still forthcoming, but the gay rights group Lambda Legal is already planning a challenge and says that challenge will be filed as soon as the plan is revealed. Sharon McGowan is Lambda's legal director of strategy, and she joins us tonight. Sharon, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you, Tucker. Thanks.
Thanks. So I just want to know if I understand the idea behind this, not necessarily the legal details, but the kind of philosophical idea. Is it that transgender troops have a right to serve in the military, which is to say anyone who wants to serve has the right to serve? Is that the idea?
Well, what Secretary Carter said back in 2016 when he announced the rollout of the policy is that our American military needs to have all hands on deck. And so any man or woman who is able to meet the qualifications, physical, mental, emotional qualifications for service, the American military wants to have those individuals available to them. So the issue here is making sure that we don't put discriminatory barriers in place that take people out of the running who otherwise have talents that we could put to the American defense.
So if you were to do a survey of active duty colonels and the majority said we don't want transgender troops, nothing personal, but it's just too much expense, too much trouble, would that be enough for you? Would you say that's military doesn't want transgender troops, we're going to drop our challenge, it's okay now?
No, that wouldn't be enough, because what we know is that a policy like this...
Then
well,
what were you talking about then? I'm sorry, you just said you are filing a challenge because you think the military wants transgender troops, but Trump is getting in the way. And so I said if you found out they really didn't want transgender troops, you'd still file a challenge? Why?
Well, in a world in which we are taking a blanket ban approach and disqualifying a category of people who are otherwise eligible and able to meet the qualifications for service, that is discrimination. And that is neither good for the American military, nor is it consistent with American values. And so that is why we see, 18 of our allied nations throughout the world having open service with transgender individuals. And Tucker, you and I both know that many of these arguments are the exact same arguments that we heard in opposition to open service by gay and lesbian women.
I know what you're going to say. Just spare me on that. Hold on. Hold on. Okay, then if you want to go down that road, let me ask you this question then. I'd like to serve in the military. Let's say I want to serve in the military. I can. I'm 48 years old. I'm at least 8 years too old by current Pentagon rules to serve. Now, I'm kind of offended by that because I'm a patriotic American. I'm not in great shape, but I could probably do it. And they're keeping me out on the basis of my age. They're practicing ageism. Do you think I have legal standing to sue?
And look, Tucker, I applied for West Point, but I have lazy eye, and I wasn't allowed to serve either. The fact is
I'm asking you, hold on, slow down. I'm asking you a sincere question. Military regulations say people over 40 can't join. So are you saying that that's okay? That's okay with you? That seems kind of arbitrary to me.
But the fact
but that's okay with you for some reason? Why?
We are talking about whether or not being transgender is something that disqualifies you from military service. And the fact is that when you have certainly have all of our...
It always was.
So the fact that it always was doesn't necessarily answer the question, because as we know, African Americans were not able to serve, and we have no doubt about the valor with which they serve. Women have...
Why can't people over 40 serve? I don't understand. Why can't people over 40 serve?
People over 40 cannot enlist because the military has sort of made an assessment, with respect to sort of certain qualifications. But this is one of those places where you have both.
Oh, I get it. So you're making the same argument that the military made about transgenders up until a couple of years ago when Obama decided to get involved. They said, we've assessed this, and by the way, it's too much trouble. It doesn't help readiness to have transgenders here. You're making that exact same argument. Are you even aware of that?
But Tucker, the point is that, and even with our own military,
what's the point? I'm losing track of the point.
So the point is that when you have a blanket ban that takes out qualified men and women who are otherwise able to serve based on a characteristic that has nothing to do with their ability to serve this country, that hurts our military and is inconsistent with American values.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really think you're arguing from principle here, but let me just ask you one last question, and it's a sincere one. I'm nothing against transgender people, but why should the U.S. military be on the hook for sex change surgery? Why is that germane to, war fighting? Why should taxpayers have to pay for that? I've never understood that.
Tucker, this isn't a fight about transgender people and having surgery. This is about transgender Americans who want to serve, who are willing to take a bullet.
I'm asking you a sincere question. Please do me the honor
of our country,
and
they should not be
I'm asking you a sincere question.
Transgender people are more than the sum total of their medical care. In the same way that women who may rack up medical bills when they get pregnant, Tucker, we all know that transgender men and women serve with valor and distinction.
That's not a real answer. You know what? You got to give me more of the bumper stickers. I'm sorry that you didn't. Sharon, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. We'll be right back.